Remember to subscribe. Otherwise, you will be abused by a Bigfoot.
My name is Thomas. I am 23 years old and a salesman by profession. I live in Montana and have done so all my life. This event took place 10 years ago when I was 13 years old and lived at home with mom and dad and 2 older brothers. If I were to give this story a title, it would probably be Bigfoot Gave Me 2 Moms. Dad, one of my older brothers, and I had decided to camp for a weekend in mid-September. The campsite we so often used was beautifully situated by a small lake, a few miles west of Helen National Park. We arrived at the place where we always parked the car just before dawn, and after we had put on our packs, we started our journey, following the path that led almost all the way to the campsite. We were all in a great mood and whistled together as we walked in line. My brother, who was walking behind me, poked me in the back and jokingly asked if I was starting to get tired in my feet, even though we had only walked a little over half a mile. I said that there was probably a greater risk that he would collapse rather than me, so that my father and I had to carry him the rest of the way. Jeffrey was a nice big brother, although at times he could not resist teasing me a little. Dad, who went first in line, turned his head and said that he had longed for this camping trip for several weeks, and that his gut feeling said that this weekend would be something out of the ordinary, something to remember for the rest of our lives. Well, but the bottom line is that he was actually right, in a way. When the path eventually began to turn east, it was time to continue straight ahead through the dense pine forest. Our destination was about a mile ahead of us. The sun, which had initially warmed our faces, had now disappeared behind a rather thick cloud cover, so the forest suddenly felt very dark and a little scary. Of course, I kept these thoughts to myself. I did not want to give Jeffrey a chance to call me a coward or a chicken. No way. About 30 minutes later, the forest began to open up and we saw the lake a bit in front of us. Dad and Jeffrey started setting up the tent in the usual place, which lay on a flat patch of grass right near the shore. I myself sat on a large rock, rested my tired legs and looked out over the calm lake. The previously eerie feeling I had felt in the dark forest had now disappeared. I had not had time to sit and rest for very long before Dad asked if I could start collecting firewood. I obeyed him and started searching for firewood near the camp. I was not very anxious to go into the dark forest alone. The truth was that I had a latent phobia for bears and other predators. Of course, I had heard about Bigfoot and many other cryptids, but I had told myself that it was mostly about fabricated stories. When Dad and Jeffrey had set up the tent, they also started collecting firewood, and within about an hour, we had enough firewood to make it through the evening and night. Dad made a small fire so we could make our dinner, which consisted of beans and bacon. All the food you cooked out in the woods tasted absolutely fantastic, but beans and bacon in particular had always been one of my favorites. Eating beans and bacon, and then sitting there and farting together was so typically American, Dad used to say. He also believed that modern inventions, such as MREs, were nothing more than twaddle, and something that might be suitable for people in the gay community. Once, a salesman tried to sell a pack of MREs to Dad. Dad had then pushed the salesman up against the wall, and asked if he looked like a gay person. I felt so proud of my dad on this occasion. Dad had always been a man's man, a typical American man's man with hair on his chest and big balls. When we had eaten our dinner, we sat there and farted, while we listened to Jeffrey playing harmonica. It was cozy. It felt like you were in a Western movie. And as if to reinforce this feeling, Dad pulled his .375 Magnum out of his backpack. He sat for a while and weighed it in his hands, and then said, "Boys, if you have one of these in your hands, there is nothing you need to fear." Nothing. He looked at us with squinting eyes and added, "You can even send a Bigfoot straight to hell with one of these." Jeffrey stopped playing his harmonica and asked Dad if he believed in Bigfoot. Dad said he was hesitant, but that he had heard of a Russian elder who had his balls totally destroyed by a Bigfoot about 10 years ago. Jeffrey shuddered and said that the worst thing that can happen to a man is to lose his balls. "That's right, son," Dad said, nodding thoughtfully. "Our whole masculinity is in our balls," he said, getting up. "That's what sets us apart from all the ladies." Then he walked away, probably to relieve himself. I threw back Jeffrey's previous question to himself. I asked if he himself believed in Bigfoot. He replied that there was apparently a dude named Matt Moneymaker who ran around in the woods and howled like a lunatic in an attempt to attract Bigfoots, quite unsuccessfully. But apparently this dude was convinced that Bigfoot existed. I laughed when I saw the scene before my inner eye, how this dude ran around in the woods and howled like a screwball. "Obviously this dude has 0 balls," I said, and we both laughed. After sitting for a while and having fun at Matt Moneymaker's expense, it struck me that Dad was nowhere to be seen. Jeffrey said he had seen Dad go into the woods a while ago. "You know what he's like," Jeffrey said. "He does not have enough peace in his body to be able to sit still for very long. I'm pretty sure he's studying some interesting animal tracks or something." It sounded logical. As the hunting enthusiast father was all in his fiber, he did not miss a single animal track, ever. Jeffrey and I jumped to our feet when we heard a loud scream in the woods. It was Dad. "Shit, Dad must have been attacked by a bear," Jeffrey said. "And his gun is in his backpack." He threw himself on Dad's backpack and found the Magnum pretty quickly. After making sure that the weapon was loaded, he shouted, "Come on! We have to get there, fast!" But we had not taken many steps before we stopped in our tracks, when something with a scream came flying out of the forest in our direction. It was a person who came flying in an arc high in the air. Its dad was the only thing I had time to think before he hit the lake behind us with a violent splash. Jeffrey immediately threw off his outerwear and jumped into the lake. He swam up to Dad, who seemed lifeless, and began to tow him ashore. Dad started coughing up water, which was a sign that he was alive. I stood on the shore, biting my nails. I helped Jeffrey pull Dad up on land. He was groggy, but otherwise did not seem to be injured, at least not what you could see with the naked eye. "What the fuck did just happen?" asked Jeffrey, who was kneeling next to Dad. "It was a fucking Bigfoot," Dad said and made an unsuccessful attempt to sit up. "A Bigfoot? Seriously?" Jeffrey asked. "What about your balls? Are they broken or what?" I started to cry when I thought that Dad might have met the same fate as that Russian old man he had mentioned earlier in the day. I could not hold back my tears. "My balls are fine, son," Dad replied and finally sat up. He clapped his hand lightly against his crotch to make sure he was telling the truth. "But we must leave immediately. We have to leave our packs. Give me the gun." I picked up Dad's .357 Magnum, which was lying on the ground next to my feet, and handed it to him. "Let's go," said Dad as he got up snorting. We left the camp behind. None of us even had a thought of putting out the fire, which had begun to burn down. We chose to take the same path back as we had come. Dad thought that the choice of route did not matter at all. Dad went first in line with his .357 Magnum ready in his hands. He jumped up and aimed his weapon at the slightest sound in the surroundings. And if I had thought that the forest felt a little creepy on the way to the camp, there was nothing close to how it felt at this moment. Dad told me that he had just relieved himself and started following a couple of footprints he could not identify when this creature attacked him. The creature had rushed forward, grabbed Dad and thrown him away, apparently without the slightest effort. When we had traveled for about 10 minutes, the silence in the forest was broken by a loud growl. "Be prepared," Dad said, looking in the direction we all agreed the sound had come from. He looked at us over his shoulder and said, "Wait here." Then he slowly began to sneak forward, in the direction the growl had come from. Suddenly, an explosion occurs when the creature rushes out between two spruces and sends up a shower of branches in the air. Dad barely has time to turn his head before the creature grabs him and disappears with him into the dense forest. After a few seconds, Dad's cry for help is heard. To my horror, I see that the gun is on the ground where Dad was standing a moment ago. Without thinking, I run there and pick up the weapon. "Give it to me," Jeffrey shouts, but I answer, "No," and begins to run in the direction of Dad's cry for help. I hear Jeffrey's footsteps and swear words behind me. I find Dad lying on his back on the ground. The creature stands very close and looks down at him with a furious face. "Shoot him! What are you waiting for? Shoot him in the balls!" Dad shouts, trying to extend the distance to the creature by slowly crawling away. Yes, I can now see that this 10 feet tall Bigfoot is male. I hold the gun with both hands, raise it and aim at the creature's coconut-sized balls. I squeeze the trigger, but miss and hit way too high up. The creature takes a few steps back and growls. "You schmuck!" Jeffrey shouts behind my back. "How could you miss?" Dad, who has now gotten to his feet, seizes the opportunity and starts running towards me. The creature immediately picks up the hunt for Dad, and has already grabbed him, when I fire 2 shots in sheer panic. First, everything is completely still. Then the creature loosens its grip on Dad's shoulders, and slowly begins to retreat. Dad falls to his knees, and places his hands over his crotch. He looks at me in surprise, before slowly falling backwards with a groan. "You schmuck, you hit Dad!" Jeffrey cries as he runs to Dad. I lower the pistol which I still hold in my outstretched hands. A little while later, I also kneel next to Dad and cry, while he announces I hit him in the balls with both shots. Jeffrey alternately strokes Dad's forehead and alternately looks in among the trees where the creature disappeared. Dad grabs my hand and holds it, while he looks me seriously in the eye and says, "Thomas, you must not blame yourself for this. You must not blame yourself for destroying my balls. You did your best, son." He lets out a deep sigh and then says, "But things will change from now on, boys. For example, my voice will change in pitch. In time, I will sound just like your mother." Jeffrey shakes his head and protests with tears in his eyes, but Dad just pats him on the shoulder and continues, "I'm bleeding pretty bad, but I'll survive, and that's the most important thing." Then he turns his attention to Jeffrey and says, "Jeff, you must promise not to be angry with your brother. You must not blame him. Now it's you two who will be the real men in our house." I feel the need to shorten this story by giving a brief summary of what happened next. Jeffrey and I managed to get Dad to the car, and he had enough strength to get behind the wheel and drive all the way to the emergency room, where he was immediately taken care of. And quite rightly so, both of his balls were totally destroyed. And Dad's voice changed relatively quickly, just as he had predicted. Within a month, it was no longer possible to distinguish between the voices of Mom and Dad. And it was probably because of that Dad lost his job as a police officer. Of course, not many people believed in our story either. The only person who believed in our story straight off was the investigator and author, David Paulides, who also dealt with our experience of horror in his book, Broken Balls in Bigfoot Land, A Sobering Dilemma. And Jeffrey, he could never forgive me. He blamed me for having 2 mothers. Of course, I was the one who castrated our dad. But had it not been for Bigfoot, it would never have happened. So I blame Bigfoot. I will always blame Bigfoot. Thank you, Abused by Bigfoot, for telling my story to the public. Sincerely, Thomas.